Hello and welcome to the lecture on sessions. So let's understand what is session, how to create them, how to read and delete them. So sessions is nothing but an array. It's very simple to understand. It's an array that is stored at the server based on some ID. Okay, remember that every session that is stored has something called as session ID. And it's very important to understand session ID is basically the key to access your sessions. Okay, sessions is nothing but an array. It is stored at the server side and it has a key using which you can access the session. If you understand this line, basically you understand what is session. It has all the components that you need to understand and define a session. Session is an array. Okay, it has some array values you can store as an array, and you can store any values that you want. Okay, and it is stored at the server side. Cookies store at the client side, session store at the server side, and every session that is stored has something called as session ID. Okay, and session IDs are generated when the user first time visit the site. So when there's a new request happens, a new session ID has been created, and these session IDs are stored at the cookies. So understand the relationship between the cookie and a session. So when a user logs in into the page, the session is being created at the server with a session ID. But how does the browser knows? If you have 1000 browsers accessing the server, how does it uniquely identify this is my session? So when a session is created at the server, there is something called as session key, and these session key are stored in the browser as a cookie. So whenever a cookie is being sent over to the server, the cookie will tell us, okay, this is my session ID, and based on the session ID, the server will pick up that session and give that session array to that particular request. Okay, so that's how basically the relation between a client and the server happens with the session, and the whole logic happens with the session ID, which is stored, which is created at the server side, but the session IDs or references are stored at the client side as a cookie. So every time a user makes a request to the server, this cookie is passed to the server with the session ID, and based on the session ID, server is able to maintain an active session of the user. You have to understand this concept very well. To understand this concept, you have to understand how cookies work. So when a user login into the system, a session ID is being stored as a cookie on their server. So every request that user is doing to the server, it is telling this is my session ID, and that's it. With that session ID, you get to access all the variables, data, or all the actions that has been done by the user stored at the server side as a session. Okay, if a session is already created for that specific user, the PHP will not duplicate the session. Okay, so it's easy to understand. If you have a session key already, then it will not be duplicated. Okay, by default PHP use cookie to store session ID in each browser. Then the browser pass the cookie to the server with each request. How to start the session? This is the first type. When you want to start and create a session ID, you have to say session_start. This is used to start a session. Automatically session ID is created, pass over to the user on the client, and client store that as a cookie. You don't have to worry about all those things, right? That is the internal part. What I've explained you is how it actually works, but what you have to understand is how do I start a session. How this relationship between the client and the server happens is with this single function. You just have to say session_start only once. Okay, wherever you want to put this, you put it somewhere, but it only happens only once. Then how do you create it? Once you say session start, you can have the session variable, that's your global variable, and you start putting the values in it. It's an associative array. It's an array. You just store some value in it. Then you can read a session variable, right? You can read a session variable. Then you can delete, is basically you say unset, right? You unset that particular variable. Very simple. It's an array. All these things is basically is an array, right? We have looked at associative array, and this is how you basically play around with an array. An array is basically nothing but is an underscore session global variable. Is an array, and you just add value, read value. You can even update the value like this, and then you can unset, means you delete the session key. All right, very simple to understand. Let's do a simple exercise to understand this concept. So let's create a folder. We'll create a file, session.php. Open this up. The first thing that you have to do is session_start. Okay, then the session will start. Session will start means all the session IDs created, the session ID will be passed from client to server, is stored as a cookie. Everything is handled over that one method, and you have to say that first. Okay, without saying you cannot access session variables. How to create a session? Just like that. It's an array, so you can say first name, and you can say PHP bootcamp, that is creating. And how do you access that? The same way you create, you just access it. That's how you read the session. Okay, it's very, very simple. A session is nothing but arrays. Okay, there's nothing behind it. It's just an array. It's just that it understands who is basically accessing this session and who, for which user this session has been created. Okay, so now let's open this page. Okay, so it knows that this has been created for PHP bootcamp. Okay, and what we can do is we can assign it from an get, right? And we can say name. Okay, we'll pass this name as a URL param. We'll store in the first name, we'll display that as a first name. So how to do that? We say name is equal to bootcamp. Okay, for this it is PHP bootcamp, for this it is PHP bootcamp number 1. Okay, so for this it is this session, and for this it is this session. Okay, so now the user has 2 sessions, and if you try to print over another page, you cannot see that session, right? Even though you are accessing the same variable, you see I'm trying to access the same variable, but it's unable to get that session because for this browser, for this particular session, the user is different. For this user is different, the user is different here. All right, so that's how basically session works. So for this user, this is the PHP bootcamp data has been stored in that session. Okay, it's the same variable but stored it for a different session. Okay, and for this it has different session. Okay, so it's very simple to understand. You have to remember that you have to do session start. Once you do session start, you basically can start the session, and then you have to use as an array, you have to assign the value, get the value. Okay, for deleting the session, you basically can set unset. Okay, this is how you delete the session variable. Okay, so that's all for this lecture on how to work with session. I'll see you in the next one.